Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Think Orange podcast, where we want to encourage and equip leaders like you who are investing in the faith and future of the next generation. I am Trey McKnight, your host, and in this season of the podcast, we're interviewing some of the speakers we're hosting at Orange Conference 2022. That's right, it's coming this April. Now, we'll talk about what it means to be human and how our churches can better care for the humans in our communities. We are so excited for you to get to hear this conversation with our interviewer, Dave Adamson, and our guest, Dr. Kara Powell. Kara Powell, PhD, is the executive director of the Fuller Youth Institute and a faculty member at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's named by Christianity Today as one of the 50 women to watch. Kara speaks regularly at parenting and leadership conferences. She's the author of a number of books, including Growing Young and The Sticky Faith Guide for Your Family. Kara lives in Pasadena with her husband, Dave, and their 3 children. You are going to absolutely love this conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Hey, Kara, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on the Think Orange podcast. How are you?
I'm doing really well. And Dave, I just love how you say my name with your accent. I just love it. It's so melodious the way you say it. So thank you. Thank you for saying my name so Australian.
I want to be super honest with you. I have a card here to remind myself to extend the A so that I say it as close as possible because I want to honor you and what your parents decided to call you. Am I getting that close? Am I close?
You're really close. Yeah, it's Kara. So You're super close. Yeah. Not all of us can have a name as unmess-upable as Dave. Yeah. So sorry, not all of us can have that kind of a name. But yeah, you're really close. Kara, great.
Well, I appreciate your grace, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us today on the podcast. As you know, the theme for Orange Conference this coming year is Be Human. And so I wanted to just start by asking you, what do you think it means to be human?
Well, the beauty is that's who we are. That's how God's designed us. And in fact, I would start there. That what it means to be human is to start with an understanding that we're created in the image of God. In fact, when you mention Orange Conference and I say image of God, I remember, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Reggie Joyner did a presentation, main stage at Orange, talking about how we're created in the image of God. And he had us do this call and response about image of God. And I think that's scriptural. Yeah. That's in all of us. And that's really in Orange's DNA also, is to appreciate that we're made in God's image. God's designed us to be in relationship with each other, just like God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit are in relationship with each other. I think part of what it means to be in the image of God is to reflect or mirror that kind of interdependent relationship that we see in the Trinity. So when I think about what it means to be human, that's where I start. Yeah. And there's a second phrase that's really important too, is not just image of God, but also that we as humans are sinners. And we're in constant need of experiencing Jesus' salvation and ongoing sanctification. Yeah. So I think being a human is both this beautiful aspect of God being our creator, and yet this daily challenge, tension, struggle of being sinners, and seeing the two of those weave together and ultimately experience victory through Jesus.
Yeah. How amazing is it that while we are sinners, God still in our humanness accepts us and loves us and compels us to do good in the world, isn't it? How amazing that is.
And that God sent Jesus to be a human. Yeah. How godlike for God to redeem humans through sending God's Son as a human, which is just so profound and poetic and iconic, I think, of who God is. So, that's on the infinitely long list of what's amazing about Jesus. The fact that Jesus has some experience with our humanity, I think, is part of that list.
That's so good. Like 2 minutes into this, and you've already blown the roof off this conversation and the podcast. I knew that this would happen. Hey, I remember that call and response thing that Reggie did, and how that was just such a great reminder, a moment of being reminded that we're human. So I wanted to ask, on the back of that, what is something that you do, maybe on a regular basis, that reminds you of your humanness?
Okay, I'm going to say I take naps. Like, I'm an Enneagram 3. Like, I know I'm supposed to have a wing, but I'm such an Enneagram 3 achiever. I don't even really think I have a wing. Like, I'm all about like, let's be purposeful. Let's be intentional. Let's prayerfully determine outcomes, and then let's create a process to achieve those outcomes with God's help and with God's leading, et cetera. And I love a good nap. And, typically on Saturday and or Sunday, there's about an hour that I carve out in the afternoon just to rest. And, I think kind of recalibrate and get that sleep that I need as a human. So that's honestly the first thing that came to my mind, not super spiritual, but actually, I think sleep is an act of faith where we say, we trust you, God, that you are working even when we're not a part of that, when we can't see and experience it directly. We know that you're working. And so I actually think napping is pretty spiritual. So
I think extremely spiritual, especially, Kara, when you consider that the first thing in all of Scripture that's defined as holy is rest. That's the first thing. It's not God. It's not the scriptures. It's not a church or a temple, but rest is holy. So I think that is an extremely spiritual answer. And I would expect nothing less from you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, boy, we're drawing a lot from Genesis here. Like, as we talk about resting and being made in God's image, there's so much in every book of the Bible, but it's fascinating how, maybe that's to be expected, that our humanness is apparent and clear from the very first pages, the first chapters of all of the scriptures. So
I love it. I love it. Hey, Kara, you obviously work with the Fuller Institute, as we talked about when we set up your resume in the introduction to this podcast. I wonder what, through your research at Fuller and with your team, what have you learned that all humans have in common? Is there anything that you guys have found?
Yeah, well, Dave, I'm not even sure you fully know this, but that's actually the topic of our latest book. So you're asking a question that's really in our strike zone that myself and Brad Griffin co-authored, called 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. And we did a lot of research studying teenagers broadly, and then deep dive interviews with 27 teenagers, very diverse from all across the US. And what we've come to unearth, and it's interesting because Orange says the very same thing. So it's kind of like God inspired both Fuller and Orange in very similar ways. We think that there are 3 questions that all humans are wrestling with.
Okay.
And much of discipleship and much of our life journey is the ongoing unpacking of these questions. And so these 3 questions are identity, who am I? Belonging, where do I fit? And purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. And, I would say those are the 3 questions that separate humans from any other, mammal. And I'm over 30 years old, as are you. And we're asking those questions. I think every human is asking those questions. There are certain stages of life, especially in transition. So that means especially, children, teenagers, young adults, really up to age 30, where those questions are at a rolling boil. So they're more at a low simmer for those of us who are older, still prevalent, still present, but not quite as heated as they are for those under 30. So I would say that's really what separates humans, is that we're wrestling with identity, belonging, purpose. And last thing I would say, discipleship is our process of embracing Jesus's best answers to those questions of who am I, where do I fit, and what difference can I make?
Do you mind diving into one of those 3? Maybe the last one I think would be my pick. I'm happy to pick one, but that would be my pick. Do you mind diving a little bit deeper into that and talking more about purpose and what you guys have uncovered?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things that we think is that while these are 3 common questions, we each have a question that kind of leads the way for us.
Yeah.
Each of us, that's maybe the one that where God tends to grow us the most, maybe where we struggle the most, maybe where our proclivities are. And so my hunch is, since you went to purpose, I wouldn't be surprised if that's your leading question.
Probably.
Is wanting to be involved in seeing our world changed for the better.
Yeah.
And so part of what we did in our research is we looked at young people's, and again, these were 13 to 18-year-olds, current answers to those questions.
Yeah.
And so the good news when it comes to purpose is that young people, I'll highlight two things currently. They are involved in service. Yeah. And the 27 teenagers we interviewed were all youth group kids. So maybe I'm sure that skews it some, but they were all involved in service, which was inspiring. And a lot of why they served, this is a little bit less inspiring, is because they were trying to please others. It's what others expect of them. It's what their family expects. It's what their church youth ministry expects. It's what their college counselor expects. Yeah. I serve so I can put it on my college application. And so, as we think about, again, discipleship is Jesus's best answer. Yeah. The best answer, the Jesus-centered answer that we would love for all generations, and especially young people, to embrace is, we're not serving so we feel better about ourselves, so we please any human, so that we look good on our college application. We're serving because we're part of God's better story. We're part of God's great story. And in fact, when I had the chance to speak at my 12th graders baccalaureate last May, that was actually the theme of my 12-minute talk is, God has a great story, figure out your page. Wow. And I think part of what we can do as adults, journeying alongside families, journeying alongside children, teenagers, is we help them figure out that page. We help them figure out, their gifts, their talents. And I'll just say, I saw some Barna research today. I saw it saying that roughly, I'm gonna make up percentages because I don't remember the exact percentages, but about 80% of Christians believe that God's given them gifts and talents to use in the world. And this is Christian adults. So the majority, I wish it was 100, but 80% is still pretty good that believe they have gifts and talent. Here's what's terrible, is only 50% of this same group knew what their gifts and talents were, roughly. So, these are adults. These are adults, Dave, who don't know their gifts, talents, how God wants to, write a story through them, how God wants to write God's story through them, let alone, what's the percentage for teenagers, children, 20-somethings, almost certainly even lower than that 50%. So again, I think it gives us an opportunity as adults, small group leaders, pastors, parents, guardians, et cetera, to journey alongside a young person and help them figure out how God might want to be, work through them for God's purposes to come here on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah. Wow. I wonder, in preparing and writing this book, did you get a chance to research any ways that technology has impacted what purpose it has? I remember reading a study, I think that it was conducted in 2017 in the UK that showed, they studied a certain number of 14 to 18-year-olds, and they just, what the results were that there were three main roles, three main careers or jobs that those teenagers wanted to have when they quote unquote grew up. The first one was a doctor, which always gave me hope that people still want to be doctors, because that's good.
We need medical doctors.
Exactly. The second one, pretty close behind that, was an influencer, and the third one was a YouTuber. So of the top three, two of them are technologically minded. So I'm wondering, how has your team figured out, or have you found out what role technology plays when it comes to kids who are looking for purpose?
And I'm just struck that, those last two that were tech related, it's not like engineers or computer science programmers, it's YouTubers, influencers. Well, okay. And that's, first of all, I'm very pro technology. You and I have talked a lot, Dave, and I know you've written a book on how the church can move more into digital ministry. So, technology is what's letting us talk today in different continents and different time zones. And it's what lets this become a podcast that others listen to. So I think technology is awesome. When it comes to purpose, there's many ways that I think technology helps by helping us all, but especially our young people, stay in touch with the needs of the world. So, I'll just say here in the US, summer of 2020, we were in such a season of talking about racial justice, racial reconciliation after the George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
And, we had all three of our kids home at the time. We're like 2018 and 14 because of the pandemic. They were all home. And like every night at dinner, I would ask, my first question would be, okay, what'd you see on social today about race? And that would unlock a 5-minute conversation or a 45-minute conversation, because my kids were seeing things and exposed to things more than me and before me, because they were involved in social media. And I love that. Like there's so much that's good about that. They understand different perspectives. They understand people from different social locations, et cetera. I think the downside to technology when it comes to purposeful work with young people, especially, is they can feel like if I post about something and put #justice, then I'm doing substantive work. And like that does help. I've done that too. You've probably done that too. That does help. But I think often God's inviting us into deeper advocacy on behalf of those who are marginalized, those who are being oppressed, et cetera. Than just posting on social. So I think social it certainly keeps us informed and helps us learn more about the needs of the world and opportunities of the world. It can become a bit of a placebo for deeper, more meaningful engagement. So we with ourselves and with our young people, let's keep inviting them and us into, posting and doing something in addition to that. So it's you said this earlier, right? That your research for this book showed that teenagers were more inclined to be serving and seeing that as being a high purpose, right? Because part of being human is helping other humans. What's coming into my head is that famous Abraham Joshua Heschel quote, where as he was, working with Martin Luther King in the civil rights era, said that he had the opportunity to pray with his feet because he actually got out and did stuff to help people. So what I'm hearing you say is you're still seeing that is a priority for a lot of teenagers today, is to help other humans. Yeah. And I think that's something, awesome about young people in general, across generational cohorts. And I think this generation in particular has a heightened interest, maybe because they have heightened awareness of the needs of the world. They have a heightened interest in being able to respond to the needs of the world. And, that's where I would say creative churches and ministries in the midst of the pandemic, and, we're post-pandemic, still in the pandemic. I don't even know how to describe it these days, Dave. But, life is not back to normal. And a lot of kids are not as busy as they were. I mean, that was during quarantine, that was in the midst of all the terribleness, kids had more free time. And creative churches and ministries were figuring out, gosh, how do we channel kids' passions and interests and abilities, often through technology, to serve others, to serve our church, to serve people who can't leave their home, et cetera. And I want us to keep doing that. As we're in kind of a pseudo-normal time now, and as we get back to whatever normal is going to be, I think helping young people be involved in, praying with their feet will change them. This is going to be a second time I mention my good friend Reggie Joyner here, but honestly, what I quoted more than anything else during the pandemic, outside of the Bible, what I quoted more than anything else, Reggie has this great line that a kid may get over what I teach them, but they will never get over God working through them. And I think that's really true. Like one of the best ways that we can help young people experience their humanness, understand others' humanness, get that Jesus' answer to that question of purpose is to be involved in God doing amazing work in and through them.
That's so good. Kara, you said earlier that, technology means that our teenagers, our kids and students, they're more aware of what's happening in the world than ever before, than we were when we were growing up and we were their age. I'm also struck by the idea and the understanding that they're also more aware of opposite views to Christianity. We're trying to bring them up with faith, but it's so much easier to find opposite views to faith when they're online. So I wonder, I would love your opinion on what you think the church can do to, continue to answer the questions that students have and kids have about faith.
Yeah. Oh, great question, Dave. So, as humans, we're constantly changing and learning.
Yeah.
And our faith is too. And I think there's this interesting paradox that we as adults, we want young people's faith to grow, but we don't want it to change.
Yeah.
Which really doesn't make sense, right? If their faith is going to grow, then by definition, it's going to somehow change. And so one of the big surprises during the last decade of our research has been how important it is to give young people a chance to express and explore their doubts. That the majority of high school students, and our research was on high school students, majority of high school students in the US youth group kids experience significant doubts about God. About 70% experience doubts about God. Now, that in and of itself isn't a bad thing, because when those same young people have the opportunity to express and explore those doubts, that's actually correlated with greater faith maturity.
Yeah.
Or put more simply, doubt isn't toxic to faith. Silence is. And so, when it comes to us helping young people come to terms with their humanness, how do we make the church and families a greenhouse for those tough questions? Whether it's, and sadly, we tended to hear in high school more examples of children's ministry leaders who didn't handle this well. But, imagine when that third grader comes into Sunday school, comes into, children's ministry and asks their pastor or small group leader, volunteer, why would God allow this terrible natural disaster? Or why would God allow their parents to get divorced? And sadly, what we often heard is that well-intentioned adult would kind of shush them and say, we don't ask questions like that about God here. We trust God. Yeah. And what that third grader ended up learning is not only the church couldn't handle their tough questions, but God couldn't handle their tough questions.
Yeah.
And so, what we want for children's and student ministry leaders is that we equip our volunteers and we know ourselves how to respond person asks a tough question. And I'll just quickly say, here's my response. I use it on a regular basis because I have a PhD, I've gone to 26 grades of school, and the average seventh grader can stump me with their questions about God. And God is God. And if we could explain and fully understand God, then God really wouldn't be God. So I'm glad there are elements of God that we can't fully understand or explain. But still, we need to know how to respond to that seventh grader who's going to stump us, or that third grader. And so here's I just offer this, something that's been really helpful for me is to say, I don't know, but. Gosh, that's a great question. I don't totally know, but how about if you, me, and your mom, we get together and we talk about it next week over coffee?
Yeah, that's so good. You've actually made me think of about 12 different questions that I want to ask you on the back of that, which again is not unusual whenever I talk to you. Again, for every time that you quote Reggie, I feel like I need to quote Abraham Joshua Heschel. So I'm going to quote him one more time.
I just love that you're quoting Heschel. That's awesome, Dave.
He's one of my favorite theologians. I absolutely love him to death. Nice. And it was something actually I wrote this in my book about asking questions. The great quote from him that says, "We are closer to God when we have questions than when we think we have all the answers." I wonder what your take on that would be based on the research you've had, especially around students. Do you think that they're closer to God when they have questions than when they think they have all the answers?
I think that they're close. I would modify that a bit. I mean, at the risk of modifying the great Abraham Heschel, I would modify that a bit, which is we're closer to God when we're in community asking those questions together. I think part of why unexpressed doubt is so toxic is because it kind of festers. Yeah. And so what I want for all generations, but especially young people, is that, it's back to identity, belonging, and purpose. They have a place where they belong that feels safe for them. Hopefully church, hopefully family, hopefully some good friends, where they can ask those questions. So I would say that's when we're ultimately closer to God, when we're in community wrestling with those questions together. So that, based on our research, that's the slight nuance I would bring to that statement.
I think that is excellent nuance. We're closer to God when we're asking questions in community than when we think we have all the answers on our own, or feel like we can't, to your point about being silent, when we can't ask those questions. That to me, Kara, brings up, that to me is relevance, right? I think in church world, we have a definition of relevance that is smoke machines, moving lights, hipster glasses, skinny jeans, deep V-neck t-shirts. But relevance really is meeting the needs of somebody in the moment that they have them. And so what I'm hearing you say is when kids have questions, meet that need in that moment, right?
Yeah, totally. And let me just say, Dave, like, you get bonus cool relevant points just from your accent. Like, so you're already ahead of most of us, just, in the relevant factor with your accent. But back to your actual question, one of the reasons that Brad Griffin and I wrote this book, 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, is because we heard about a 15-year-old. And I think, this particular 15-year-old is iconic of a lot of 15-year-olds who said, I wish the church would stop answering questions I'm not asking. It's like they're drop the mic moments. Like, I wish the church would stop answering questions I'm not asking. Wow. Which means, like, we need to stop and listen to what young people are really wrestling with, what my colleague Scott Cormode calls their losses and longings. Like, listen to what they're going through. And I would say that generally what they're navigating is identity, belonging, and or purpose questions. And so peeling back the layers, understanding what they're really seeking after, and then journeying alongside them as they move toward Jesus's best answers for those 3 big quests.
Yeah. That's really good. Can we get practical on that just for 1 second?
Sure.
So how can churches and how can church leaders be relevant to, like, be more relevant like that, practically to the I'm thinking the humans in their community, but I'm thinking the adults as well as the students. Like, what would you say? How can a church leader be more relevant to the people in the community?
Yeah. Well, we've equipped a lot of youth leaders with this starting point, which is, I kind of hinted at it, but I'll make it more overt, like, to stop and listen to those you're trying to serve. Yeah. Both in your church and in your neighborhood, in your city, in your town, to really listen. And we actually give over 300 questions in our book for an adult to use with a young person to try to understand, like, and don't ask all 300 at once, like, just have a handful ready at once. So that you can really understand what somebody's navigating and get to the question beneath the question. Often there's a superficial question, there's something deeper. So I would say it starts really by listening. Secondly, it starts with adults journeying alongside that young person. So that small group leader, that parent, guardian, step-parent, grandparent, hopefully there's a family member who can journey alongside that young person, as well as that mentor, faith leader, whoever it might be. So, I would say those are the first 2 things that I would want for young people, is that they be listened to, and then they have an adult. My Catholic friends call this now accompaniment, or that we accompany young people. And I just love that verb. Like, how do we walk alongside a young person as they're wrestling with this? So those would be a couple real practical steps, Dave.
That's really good. I really like both of those suggestions. That's awesome. Hey, Kara, what do you think the church needs to do, the capital C church, what do you think the capital C church needs to do to ensure that it's ready for the future, based on, the conversations that you've had with both church leaders, but also with students? What advice would you give to church leaders to ensure that they're ready for what's coming next? Who knows what that might look like, whether it's technology or it's another pandemic, who knows? But what would your advice be?
Well, the good news is we have experts in our midst, and those are our young people. Like, who is better positioned to help us understand what's going on in the world and culture, and where we're going to be, 5 years from now, 5 months from now, et cetera. And so, thoughtful leaders are spending more time with young people. And, whether it's you take the same 4 young people out for coffee once a month and just ask them questions, whether it's, you sit next to a young person, both of you have your phones out, and you ask them to show you what they're most excited about on their phone.
Yeah.
Whether it's the conversations you have with young people after church, whatever it might be, it's so funny. I see leaders looking for outside resources to help them with the digital church. And, there's a degree to which that's really helpful. And we have experts in our midst who, for a cup of coffee or a burger, could give us some really good insights. And those are our young people. So, and I think this is, Dave, when it comes to young people specifically, some research that's really rattled me in the last couple of weeks is from Springtide that talks about that during the pandemic, U.S. teenagers, only 10% of U.S. teenagers heard from a faith-based leader during the pandemic. So across the U.S., 10%, only 10% heard from a faith leader. That's the bad news. The good news is in the same survey, 70% of U.S. teenagers wanted deeper, more fulfilling relationships after the pandemic. They experienced the loneliness, and now they want that sense of belonging, right? To connect with other humans. Yeah. And so I really feel like this is a divine window for us to prayerfully, thoughtfully, empathetically build relationships with young people that are truly human. So
yeah, that's so good. It's almost like the pandemic took the tide out, and when the tide went out, we saw all the gunk, the shells, the broken bottles that were underneath when it comes to especially things like you just said about loneliness and stuff like that. I know here, I know a study in the US in 2018, 2019 said that 1 in 4 teenagers felt lonely at some point. And in Australia, I was doing some research for my book just recently, and it showed that 1 in 3 teenagers felt lonely in 2020. This is people who we know have, they might have 10,000 followers, but they feel like they've got no friends who really care and look after them. So that's a really great point that we should be encouraging more church leaders to just reach out. That's awesome. Hey, Kara, what advice would you give to your younger self about being in ministry? If you could go back and right now, as you go back to young Kara and say, hey, here's my advice about ministry in 2022, what comes to mind? What would you ask? Yep. What would you tell yourself?
So I'll share the first thing that came to mind, which is my favorite passage of scripture, which is John 15. That as we abide, we bear fruit. And there have been many seasons of my life where I've been trying to bear fruit on my own, in my own human strength. And so, I reflect often, what does it look like for me to really abide in Jesus, experience Jesus, nap, sleep, take care of myself, prioritize the right priorities, because I know God's the worker. And the fruit only comes from abiding in Jesus. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, Dave.
That is so great. Kara Powell, thank you so much for joining us on the Think Orange podcast. And personally, your wisdom today, your insights today, just like always, are super profound, but you have impacted my ministry. You've impacted me as a dad more than you probably are aware. So thank you so much for being such a leading voice in this area, and for cheering on church leaders and cheering on our students as well. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you for those very kind words, Dave. It's an honor to partner with Orange to see more young people transformed by Jesus. So,
thank you.
I'd like to be the first to say thank you to Kara for joining us. Now, if you enjoyed listening to this conversation as well, you can purchase 3 Big Questions by Kara and by her cohort, Brad Griffin. You can find that in the Orange Store by going to orangestore.com, or of course, you can buy that wherever books are sold. Now, we'd also love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That's super helpful for us to get the word out and get all the wisdom that you're learning. And we love this review by Schlepp72. Schlepp said, "Wow, I'm heading into youth group ministry, and I'm loving listening to your podcast to help understand what my role is in these children's lives and in their families' lives. Keep up the hard and good work, you guys and gals." Well, thank you to you for your review. Now, we're super excited and cannot wait for you to join us at Orange Conference 2022 so that you can join the conversation and we can continue learning what it means to be human together. So, if you want to join us, go to theorangeconference.com to save your seat for an Orange Conference that I promise will be like none you've ever seen before. That's all this time. We will see you next time on the Think Orange podcast.